every morning life, go to work from day till night. Get up every morning life, go to work from day till night. I got 7 big feet and one on the way. I got a wife that always in need. What a beautiful day, good morning, Millie. What a pretty day, good morning, Millie. Put the troubles away, good morning, Millie. Get up every morning light, go to work from day till night. Get up every morning light, go to work from day till night. That's what I get ticket for pay, and no money there. Whoever tell me picnic this tree. What a beautiful day, good morning, Millie. What a beautiful day, good morning, Millie. With the troubles away, good morning, Millie. And I want to go home. Yeah, the shot and the piece of tell this I want to go home. Evening come and I'm ready to drop. Yeah, the shot and the piece of tell this I want to go home.
A place full of pleasure. Come here and it's memory you'd treasure. We just blending in like sugar. If you only desire ancient marine, great Barrow of the key, beautiful sea, awesome beauty in our belief. Tropical rain, forest, so beautiful and pure, make me even more curious. Now I'm taking the matter serious. Ancient Maya ruin, great Maya reef, door of the key, beautiful sea, awesome beauty in our belief. about the Belizean people, Creole Mestizo and Garifuna. We come together, united, work with great dignity. Ancient Maori, great Barrow, tore off the key. Beautiful sea, awesome beauty in our belief. Belizean hospitality is the best. You see when compare with the rest, like heaven would even impress those who seem to have the best. Ancient Maori, great Maori, tore off the key. Beautiful sea, awesome beauty in our belief.
Now this song is special dedicated to all Belizean musicians. We want you to come join hands with your fellow man, make music, flood up the market and big up yourself. Sweet Belizean music, take over we country with reggae and salsa, punta and soca, Congo music and broke down by brother David and Petey. Come Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Come Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat till it turn all over. Cause Belizean music take over we country, from north to south, from east to west. You can hear the drum beat that will move you off your feet. So Sugar City come rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat till it turn all over. Come Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat till it turn all over. So now that the copyright law is in full swing, Belizean musicians could come and join as one. Let's flood the market with sweet Belizean music. So Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat till it turn all over. Sugar City rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. North, south, east and west come rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Come Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Come Belizean rock, 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 rock the boat and don't stop now. Come Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat, don't stop my darling. Come Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Sweet Belizean rock, rock, rock the boat till it turn all over. Come Belizean, don't stop. Rock the boat till we take it over.
Shouting me name. Them know say me have me woman and me two picnic. But these woman don't give a damn, they want to rock it with me. But due to me bling bling chain, make them crazy for me. Due to me bling bling watch, make them crazy for me. Due to the phone on my waist, make them crazy for me. And due to the band I play with, them girl crazy for me. Truth. On the other side, the woman who run the home, cause them are the one who earning the money. But them usually made the mistake and having them man the bling. Now this is my advice to the woman working so hard. Woman, if you love your man, don't buy him no bling bling chain. Woman, if you want your man, don't buy him no bling bling watch. Woman, if you love your man, don't buy him a cell phone. Woman, if you want your man, now introduce him to your friend. Go away.
Belizeans at home and abroad, and welcome to today's virtual press conference hosted by the Prime Minister of Belize, where the government of Belize will be giving you an update on the COVID-19 situation in Belize. At the head table with us today, we're joined by the Prime Minister of Belize, Right Honorable Dean Barrow, Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Health, Dr. George Goff, Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation and Poverty Alleviation, as well as the Chair of the COVID-19 National Task Force, Ms. Judith Alpuche, Director of Health Services, Dr. Marvin Manzanero, as well as Director of the Belize Tourism Board, Ms. Karen Evans. Now, we'll turn it over to the Prime Minister of Belize for a brief overview. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Dorian. Am I being heard? Am I coming across loud and clear? I don't get any sense that there is a difficulty, so I will proceed. As the Master of Ceremonies has indicated, this press briefing is, I hope, going to be COVID specific. I'm really not prepared to get into matters political in view of my current position. So please, I would want to ask from now that we concentrate on the update we're trying to give to you and to the nation with respect to what's happening with the pandemic. Before I get into the preliminary remarks that I want to make, please allow me to do two things. Once more, to salute all the frontline workers engaged in what is clearly now an extremely protracted and increasingly difficult struggle in terms of trying to safeguard our population as much as possible from this COVID-19 scourge. You know that a number of those frontline workers have themselves tested positive. It's extremely worrying. We're trying to do our best in terms of their protection, certainly to the extent that presumably in the normal course of their duties in terms of this pandemic, there is a degree of exposure that simply cannot be protected against. What has happened in terms of a number of them being affected is extremely regrettable, but I suspect unavoidable. In any event, we want to convey our deepest solidarity with them. We know certainly of at least one death, and in that regard, we offer condolences to the family of that frontline worker. If there were additional deaths that I'm not recollecting at this moment, then likewise we solemnly ask that their souls rest in peace and offer our condolences to their comrades and, of course, naturally to their families, immediate and extended. Talking about deaths, I want to generally extend condolences and say how saddened we all are at the number of deaths that the country has suffered directly attributable to COVID-19. This thing is really absolutely devastating. Nobody is being spared in terms of the possibilities of being overtaken by this disease or by this illness, and certainly on a more personal note, it has been very troubling to see that among the very many people that have contracted the disease, that have been infected, there are two colleagues of mine, two standard bearers for the party that I led up until just last week. In one case, it was the standard bearer and his wife. As well, two ministers, first the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honorable Ugo Pat, his father-in-law has died, succumbing to COVID-19, and you'd heard earlier that the mother-in-law of Minister Elodio Aragon also died in consequence of COVID-19. So all around, it is a grim situation, and I certainly want to express once again my heartfelt sympathy for all those that have suffered in any way, and repeat the offer of condolences to all those whose family members have died in consequence of this scourge. Having said that, let me tell you how I am hoping we can proceed this morning. I will give a very brief introduction in terms of telling you about the latest decisions of the National Oversight Committee, which I continue to chair. I expect to continue to meet until a week before the actual election date for this year's general elections. So I think it is my duty for that remaining period to let you know whenever there are, in fact, consequential decisions that the NOC has taken. So I will start off by giving you the highlights of the decisions made at the meeting we just held 2 days ago on Wednesday. Then I will ask the DHS, Dr. Marvin, to speak to you in terms of his overview regarding where we are from the health point of view. At that stage, after Dr. Manza has finished with his presentation, I would want to pause and have you, the members of the media, ask Dr. Manza your questions immediately after his presentation is finished. And it is for this reason. He has a number of appointments today in terms of virtual international meetings, at a couple of which he's actually to make presentations. And so you will understand that is why we've decided to hold press conference this early, but you will also understand that we need to be able to excuse Dr. Manza as early as possible. So please, when he's finished and you are asking your questions, can you make them as pointed and as brief as possible, given the time pressures that are on him. When Dr. Manza is finished and you have done with your questions for him, we'll resume what is the normal flow and ask Dr. Goff, the CEO in the Ministry of Health, to give you an update regarding the state of play in terms of inventory, in terms of where we are with the KHMH, that sort of thing. Thereafter, no questions for him until we've all finished, and then you can ask all the rest of us, excepting Dr. Manda, your questions. When Dr. Goff is finished, then we will ask CEO Atpuche to talk to you about where things are, especially in terms of the reopening of the PGIA and how things are looking going forward. Finally, we'll ask the director of the BTB to speak to you about what the situation is like in terms of the initial flow, or trickle perhaps, of returning tourists, and how it is that we propose to handle the incipient return of tourism going forward. So, having set out the procedure, let me now tell you what, in essence, the decisions of the National Oversight Committee were at the meeting held on Wednesday, 2 days ago. First thing, the NOC agreed that the 10-day quarantine or self-isolation for Belizeans, permanent residents, qualified retired persons, work permit holders, foreign second home owners, long stay foreigners would no longer be prescribed and penalized under the Quarantine Act SI 136 of 2020. In other words, by Sunday night, so that when people wake up first thing Monday morning, there will be the amendments that would have been signed into law by the minister, amendments to the current SI 136 of 2020. And among those amendments will be the dropping, the omission of any reference to a requirement for the categories I've just indicated, and let me repeat: the Belizeans, Belizean citizens, Belizean permanent residents, qualified retired persons, work permit holders, and foreign second home owners, as well as long stay foreigners, we will drop the requirement that they be obliged to quarantine for 10 days after having come in with their PCR test or having tested negative at the airport. The reason for this is fairly straightforward. There, it turns out, is no real way of enforcing the 10-day quarantine that currently exists under the SI that is now soon to be changed. There's no way we can police these people, and we at the NOC feel that it is better to move to a regime that will see us step up in terms of the public service announcements, in terms of the campaign to get everybody, including those that are coming into the country, to abide by the fundamental rules with respect to social distancing and the wearing of masks and all that. It also struck us that since these people that are coming in via the PGIA know that there's a reopening, since they come either with a negative PCR test that's no older than 72 hours or are tested at the airport and are only allowed to enter the country if they are negative, it's inconsistent to say to them, you need to quarantine for 10 days when there are masses and masses of untested Belizeans who are able to move freely about. It doesn't make a great deal of practical sense to us, and hence the decision to switch from what is supposed to be or what is currently mandatory, breach of which is punishable by court action. We thought that the time had now come for us to move away from that regime and to go to moral suasion and this ramping up, as I said, of the public relations campaign. In other words, the people who come, who will not be obliged to quarantine, will be advised that for their own sake, they're going out into the Belizean community where there are masses of untested people, some of whom might be positive without or knowing it. And for their own sake, they might want to, in fact, voluntarily observe the 10-day quarantine, given that as well, while they would have been shown to be negative upon arrival, there is a slight chance, an infinitesimal possibility that they could become positive in the 10 days following their arrival with their negative test, or in the 10 days following a negative test, in terms of the result of a rapid antigen test done by our authorities at the airport. But the bottom line is it will not be a mandatory requirement, and so there is no question of any penalty for those who choose not to voluntarily quarantine. The second big decision, none of the permitted categories, those that I have listed, Belizean citizens, Belizean permanent residents, work permit holders, foreign second homeowners, long-stay foreigners, none of them will any longer be required to write to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or to the BTB for approval to enter Belize. That, of course, the having the right never apply to, or doesn't apply to Belizeans and permanent residents and QPRs under the current SI, but the others were obliged to write to Foreign Affairs in the case of the long-stay, the second homeowners and the long-stay foreigners. We will drop that. Also business persons who have business interests in Belize, before coming in were obliged, I think, to write to the one set had to write to Foreign Affairs, and one set had to write to the BTV. So none of them will have to write to anybody for approval. The airport is open. You can come clearly, again, on the condition that you bring your negative PCR test result, or that you are subjected to our testing at the PGIA, and that testing that we do shows you to be negative. In the context of this new arrangement, we want to make clear, we've seen where some people have come in on that airline, the acronym of which I think is TAG, from some of our neighboring countries. But they come for a short stay, and when they are about to return to their country of origin, they are asking that our health authorities administer them with a PCR test. I'm afraid that won't do. We cannot afford the extra strain on our PCR testing resources. So we'll put all this information out, and they must know, if you come to Belize, you're able to gain entry and you stay here, what requirements you have to satisfy to get back into your country in order to avoid quarantine is a matter for you. It can't be that you will feel there is any obligation on the part of the government of Belize to test you and give you, as it were, a kind of exit certificate by way of a negative PCR test. Even Belizeans who now want to travel because the PGIA is open, Belizeans who have been at home all this while, and they want to go out of the country, please, if it is non-essential travel, do not expect our health authorities to administer a PCR test to you. If it is essential travel, that's a different story. But again, we want to make it perfectly clear that while, as Dr. Goff will tell you, we're not yet close to any point where we're running short of testing supplies, still, this looks like it is really going to be a long-haul campaign. And in those circumstances, we cannot afford to use up supplies that could conceivably, in the not too distant future, become short, become scarce. The next decision of the NOC is this: private medical facilities will be allowed to conduct COVID-19 tests, but using only the types or brands of tests approved by the Ministry of Health. And they must adhere to the protocols and guidelines set by the ministry. They will have to, of course, report their test results to the Ministry of Health. But we use, as you know, the SD biosensor, and I believe one of the private facilities has already ordered some SD biosensors. There are other facilities, and perhaps Dr. Manza will speak a little bit more expansively to this, that have sought permission for other brands. In one case, the Ministry of Health did its validation exercise and found that that particular test was absolutely not up to scratch. And so that makes the point that except these private facilities who will now be allowed to test are prepared to use the tests that we can certify as being as reliable as you can get. Unless they can do that, they will not be permitted to bring in tests in which the Ministry of Health can have no confidence. So far, the two tests that are good to go are, as I said earlier, the ST biosensor and the Gene Expert rapid tests. Now remember, the Gene Expert is a form of PCR, and already there is one facility, one private facility that has indicated, I think, to Dr. Manza that they are prepared to invest in the Gene Expert machine and Gene Expert rapid tests. So, as I understand it, and if I am being inaccurate in any way, Dr. Manza can correct me when he comes to speak. But as I understand it, there are two facilities that are basically already queued up. One that will be using the ST biosensor rapid antigen tests, and another that is proposing to use the Gene Expert PCR rapid tests. Okay, the BTB, at our urging, had come up with a set of protocols for the safe corridor. You know that there has been a great deal of complaint from the tourism stakeholders. People want to come to Belize, but when they are told that in fact they will be, in essence, confined to the hotel at which they're staying, they get turned off and they say, forget it. We clearly need to do as much as we can to try to turn the tourism restart, which so far is basically a trickle. Karen will give you the numbers, into this robust flow that we need in terms of jobs, in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of the whole shebang. So the safe corridor protocols will continue, but in a transformed incarnation, again, as with the 10-day quarantine that formerly obtained for Belizeans coming back, which will be turned into recommendations. The safe corridors as well will move from being protocols that, if breached, would possibly see the tourists or whomever being prosecuted. We're going to move away from that. We're going to move away from that, and the safe corridor protocols again will be put into the category of recommendations. And just a quick word of explanation there. We were worried before the reopening of the PGIA, and when we were doing far better than we are now, that the fear that tourists coming in could infect the local population was something we had to account for. Well before that October 1st reopening, it's become clear that we are infecting ourselves. No matter how fervently we preach the gospel, and we will try to be even more ardent going forward, the border jumping, the contrabanding continues apace. And that principally, in my view, is the reason for the explosion in cases. So we've done it to ourselves. There's no question now of worrying about the tourists infecting the local population. The local population is infecting itself. You know, the BTIA had written to us some time ago, and some people were upset, chagrined at the fact that the BTIA asked the question, given what has been happening with the local explosion, given what has been happening with the laxity on the part of very many people in our society, is it that we need to worry about protecting the locals from the tourists that are coming in? Or is it that we need to worry about protecting the tourists from the locals that are here? The point is that, remember, these tourists come and are negative when they get here, according to the PCR tests that we bring, or according to the rapid tests that we administer at the airport. So there is, except if something falls through the cracks, there is not any serious likelihood of any tourist being able to infect anybody because the tourists are negative. Why then should they be confined to the property at which they are booked to stay? No, they should be allowed to interact rather more freely with the local population in terms of visiting gift shops, in terms of visiting other restaurants. When you tell them wherever you stay, if you're staying for 10 days, you must only have meals from that particular establishment. It does make sense, and as I said, it is proving to be a huge deterrent in terms of trying to attract the visitors. No, they must be allowed to move about, being advised that there are gold standard restaurants that the BTB is certifying. There are gold standard means of transportation that the BTB is certifying, and Karen will tell you about the proposal to expand the gold standard program. There are gold standard gift shops that the BTB is certifying. So we will advise the tourists that basically you should hew to the beaten path in terms of your itinerary, just ensuring that you visit establishments that are as safe as they can possibly be. In addition to that, there are the general rules that they must observe that we haven't proven very good at observing, but which are nevertheless part of the law, and where, if there are breaches, we will act, in terms of wearing a mask and social distancing and not being able to be in any crowd because there's a cap of 10 on people that are allowed to gather for social purposes, that sort of thing. So the tourists will still be required in booking, in downloading our app and in providing the information to the BTB as to where they're supposed to stay. They will still be required to stay at a gold standard property, but their movement away from that gold standard property in terms of enjoying as much as possible their vacation in this country will, as I said, be freed up, and we will move to this regime of recommendations rather than punitive protocols that must mandatorily be observed. Remember as well, in terms of the sorts of inconsistencies that motivated the NOC to move to this new regime. Belizeans, as much as Dr. Manza and his team have now tested well over 2,000 persons, in their masses, Belizeans are still untested. And they can go to the Gold Standard Hotel, and they can go anywhere during their stay. If they go to San Pedro or to Placencia for a long weekend or for a few days, they can go anywhere, and they are not tested. But the tourists who are tested and who are negative can't. It doesn't make sense. I repeat that there's far more danger from the regular Belizeans infecting other Belizeans than there could ever be from the tourists infecting Belizeans, because the tourists would have been tested and proven to be negative before they embark on their little sorties into establishments that they would want to patronize in the community where they are staying. So Judith will tell you about what now are the recommendations in terms of the safe corridor situation, the safe corridor paradigm. The next thing, the NOC deferred a proposal from the National Fitness Association to reopen gyms. I saw last night what I was told was a draft of a statement that this National Fitness Association, newly formed, I believe, was going to put out, in which they were lambasting the NOC for flatly turning down their proposal for the reopening of gyms. It is not true that their proposal has been flatly turned down. In fact, Ms. Cathy Main, the Chamber of Commerce's representative on the NOC, was tasked to work particularly with this association so that we could reach a point of agreement. And where we are is that they are asking that the Central Building Authority be designated as the entity to approve applications for reopening and to monitor compliance with the protocols that would have to be agreed before there can be any reopening, and that the CBA also be empowered then to lift that permission if persons are found in breach. It's a lot, and from what we saw at the NOC, the protocols, we are in principle in agreement with this, but the protocols have not yet been completely spelled out. The protocols that would have to be observed by the gyms and that would have to be monitored by the Central Building Authority. We wanted to move in terms of amending the current SI to take account of the other highlights that I have gone into, and so we decided that until there is more information, and in particular an enumeration precisely of the protocols that the gyms would be expected to follow, until we can find out whether the CBA, being given this authority, can be given it by the Minister of Health under the Quarantine Act, or whether the Minister of Housing under the Belize Building Act would have to sign perhaps some sort of a separate SI. Those things need to be worked out. But I make clear that despite reservations, and I looked at it very carefully and I saw where there is a division of opinion, but internationally the majority opinion seems to be that gyms are potentially extremely dangerous in terms of the spreading of the virus. But again, in an effort to try to open up and to recognize that these people are suffering economically, if we can, or when we do reach agreement with them on the particular protocols and on the policing mechanism and on the authority of the Central Building Authority, when we can reach agreement that would properly, legally cede to the Central Building Authority this remit to actually grant permits for the gyms to reopen and to police them and to take away permits if they're not in compliance. Until we can sort that all out, we decided we would have to wait and not try to include it in the amendments to the current SI, which amendments, as I say, we expect to go into effect for first thing Monday morning. The last thing to note is that we all saw the news indicating that American Airlines, for one, is looking to trial a pre-boarding testing for persons that are using American Airlines to travel to the Caribbean. We understood that they were going to begin with Jamaica and the Bahamas, but the expectation is that it would then be extended to all the Caribbean destinations to which American flies. That has not yet advanced to the point where we can say it is definitely happening in terms of Belize, but we clearly hope and expect that that's how things will turn out, and that will assist us greatly in terms of process flow. If people can be tested before boarding their flights in Miami or Houston or Los Angeles or Atlanta or wherever, that will, when again we begin to experience this robust flow of visitors, that can help us with moving people through the airport as quickly as possible, because everybody then would be certified as having tested and proven negative by American Airlines. And we expect that that sort of thing will extend to other airlines. I believe Delta has already started, United started in terms of San Francisco to Hawaii, and that sort of thing. So it's coming, and we have great hope that that will also assist us. Before I turn it over to Dr. Manza, we of course are all following very closely how things are developing with respect to a potential vaccine. Just for you to know that we have already signed up through WHO so that we can be a part of the queue for when the vaccine does become available, and WHO and PAHO argue and campaign and advocate for our region to get a fair share of that particular resource. So I will stop there and naturally take your questions at the end of all the presentations. Now turn it over to Dr. Manza. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Prime Minister. I know it's COVID-19 related, but I'll start off because today is World Food Day. That's being observed globally, and it's under the theme Grow, Nourish, Sustain, Get Our Actions or Our Future. And it's usually done as a day to highlight the progress that we made against elements of hunger and malnutrition not the traditional one. In our case, obesity can be seen as a form of malnutrition. So that's the events we are partaking on later on today. So I'll just, I had some notes in terms of the common questions that people routinely would ask us, so I hope that I am able to clarify all of those. Prime Minister already made note of the issue of PCR testing because the demands are rather increasing. Our people are asking for PCR testing when they are leaving for what is considered non-essential travel, and we simply just cannot keep up with the amount of test requests that are coming. So that's the reason why particular decisions were taken. I also make note that PCR testing is not required for those leaving Belize, because I think that's also a misconception. We are seeing people calling on us to do PCR testing because they are leaving. The country where you're going to may require it, but that's not a requirement for you to leave Belize. In terms of vaccines, Prime Minister mentioned exactly what we have signed on to. It's the COVAX facility, which is a program that intends to make vaccines available to all countries at the same time, so that it's not the countries that have a bigger economy or higher economies to have easier access to it. Belize has already made the down payment. It's $382,080, that's USD, and there's a pending payment of $2.1 million that would be payable whenever the vaccines are available. This is to cover 30% of the population in Belize. Now, just so that you can do the math, 30% of the population in Belize is approximately 120,000 vaccines. We routinely procure 40,000 vaccines in terms of flu vaccines, so that this will be 3 times the amount that we routinely procure in terms of the routine flu vaccine, which is available for free within the public health facilities. In terms of where we are with testing, just as a reminder, we have 3 different platforms that we use at Central Medical Lab: the traditional Berlin protocol on the PCR machine, the gene export, which is a quicker situation but can be difficult to get supplies, and the other protocol that we call is the pocket protocol. That's the routine sampling that we do for people who are leaving the country. As of this morning, there is still 20,000 PCR tests available. There's 13 SD biosensor rapid tests that are available, and I understand another 10,000 coming in through PAHO later on today, so that will be 23,000. This is the SD biosensor that we are using now at the airport, and we are doing it at when we do sweeps like in communities up north, and we are doing a sweep later on today at the Belisario camp in Central Farm. I'll have some notes in that. In terms of hiring of staff, because that's still a human resource situation everywhere, at least 4 new lab technicians are going to be being hired to particularly take a look at the situation at the airport, 3 medical officers and 19 nurses These are all related to COVID-19 situations, and I believe Dr. Goff would have all the other financials in terms of this, because this is, my role is a technical one. And I know there's many other items that are being procured: ventilators, portable ultrasounds, portable X-ray machines. An extraction machine, which should make the job of the people at the lab much easier, has been procured through and donated by BEL. That was delivered to them yesterday, so they're going to test run the equipment and do training virtual starting through this weekend and on next week. And there's another extraction machine that is on its way. This makes it easier, because once you do a viral swab, what you have to do is do a manual extraction of every single sample before you place it into the machine. And that's the reason why you sometimes have a delay and fatigue. So this makes one process easier for them in terms of what happens at the lab. Following the same notion of testing, indeed, private facilities too have indicated that they are willing to set up PCR option for people in private sector. One facility is in Belmopan, they just sent their paperwork yesterday, and another facility is in Belize City. Anybody else who is doing PCR testing, even though they are doing the swabbing, that PCR test actually comes to the Ministry of Health. We are the ones that are doing that particular situation. Just so you know, because it's also issues of people being affected everywhere, we have up to date 13 healthcare workers in private sector that have tested positive since the beginning of our epidemic, 46 healthcare workers within the public sector. And we have had close two facilities. There's a facility closed in Belize City as of, I believe, yesterday, because we had 2 or 3 of their staff positive, and one section of a hospital in Belize City has been closed as well, because we are following a potential outbreak in that facility. These are all private sector facilities. We also know that 2 staff members from Carl Huchner tested positive yesterday. It doesn't seem that in both cases they were infected at work, or at least not at Carl Huchner. Situation that we are following that just came through yesterday. We also make note that to date we have had 7 Coast Guards that have tested positive, 62 police officers, and 67 soldiers. Out of these soldiers, you would know that we had an outbreak about 2 weeks ago in Orange Walk. We now have detected cases at Fairweather Camp in PG, and we have a team going to Central Farm, or should be there by now, because we've identified 17 cases at Belisario Camp, so we're doing a complete sweep today. Out of these 17, 13 are being quarantined at the training academy in Belmopan, and 4 went home for home isolation. So the sweep today will entail people getting a rapid test and PCR test randomly done depending if they're positive or negative on the PCR test. The situation at the airport, I think the flow, I know that staff there is overwhelmed, but the flow has gone much, much smoother and much, much quicker than we had anticipated. I can tell you that all persons that go through the airport will go through that COVID-19 screening process. I think I need to stress that, because we do get the manifest before flights arrive, both for private and public planes arriving. Like yesterday was a private plane that arrived with 4 passengers. There's a TAG airline flight that came from Guatemala with 5 passengers, and the American Airlines flight that brought in 62 passengers. This is just data from yesterday. Out of all these passengers, 53 of them brought a PCR that could have been validated. That makes the job easier for everybody. 25 had to be swabbed. 9 of these were tourists and 16 were Belizeans, so that you know that we're still seeing more Belizeans coming back than tourists arriving. 2 other elements that I need to address before I guess there'll be questions. Is that there's multiple continuous medical education that's still ongoing. We have to thank particularly doctors like Dr. Hidalgo and Dr. Natalia Larguespal, who are spearheading this. We routinely do CMEs for medical doctors, nurses, lab persons, pharmacists. It's 6 p.m. on a daily basis. And we do work with PAHO, CARFA, and all the other entities in getting medical information, because you know the situation with COVID-19 is very fluid. One study that caught our attention that was just published earlier in the week is a study done by the Public University in Oaxaca, Universidad Benito Juárez, where they are studying genomic sequences, which is looking at the viral particles and doing further genetic studies on it. And one of their conclusions is that the mutations that they are seeing are very different from what the Wuhan virus was, the virus strain that was there. And this particular mutation is seemingly leading to a greater infectivity. And they have flagged that this is the same strain that may be affecting Guatemala. And in this, they are not specifying where geographically, but we assume it's going to be northern Belize, which is where, you know, we think the link is with Orange Walk. So if that is in point of fact true, then that can explain part of what's happening in the north, that you're having ongoing greater infections that at times becomes not really detectable, and then you see surges come at given points in time. The update from Carl Huchner, there's 8 patients confirmed, 2 are ventilated, 6 are non-ventilated. 1 of them may be going home, discharged later on today. So that's the brief synopsis I have in terms of information. One other piece is that we learn as we go along with other CARFA colleagues. We are having discussions next week with, I believe it's Thursday. Trinidad and Tobago is looking at what our process flow is through the airport. They are going to be using the same rapid test we are using, so we're looking at exchange of experiences to see what we have learned, how we are tweaking as we go along, and they will be sharing their experiences based on what they are finding before they open their airport fully like we have done. So that's my update.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Manzanero. For the media, as the Prime Minister had stated, Dr. Manzanero has prior engagements that he needs to get to, so we'll open up for questions now. I ask that you please be very direct and keep your questions limited. So we'll start with Paul. You can go ahead and start.
All right. So, Dr. Manza, good morning to the head table. I go straight into my question to Dr. Manza. We are seeing deaths recorded on a daily basis, more cases than ever before, frontline workers being infected. My question is enough being done to stop the spread of the virus in terms of the quantity of tests being carried out and the efficiency at which cases are being identified and isolated, and how will private health facilities now contribute to this cause?
As you have not, well, I just gave the numbers. I would tell you that in terms of healthcare workers, I would say 80 to 85% of those have been infected outside of the workplace. So we do try to give protection within the work environment, but we continue to stress with them that protection should not only be within the workplace, but whenever we go about doing our own personal activities. You also saw the infographic yesterday indicates that we still have about 600 tests to be processed, because we are getting now coming from everywhere. I mean, there's a sweep that's going to happen later on in a community in the Toledo district as well, because we're trying to keep up with everything. If you go back also to what the plan had entailed for us, is once you have community transmission, you cannot do the routine contact tracing one-on-one, so to speak. Then you have to kind of open up your facility and see who's going to turn up to be symptomatic. Human resources is never going to be enough, and as you move along and you have more and more cases, as you are saying. But know that for the last 3 to 4 weeks, those who are active cases have hovered around 37%, 40% max. We have not gone above 40%, so it should still be manageable for us. From the health system, what you're trying to do is you can't prevent and go to zero infections. I mean, that's kind of impossible, especially when you see what's happening in other countries that have more resources. It's trying to not have a health system that is overwhelmed and that you're not having your hospitals that are full, your ICU that is full, or that you have no other capacity in terms of ventilation. So that's what you mean really with flattening the curve. You're not really eliminating a curve. It's still an element of flattening the curve. So we will continue to work with the resources we have. We will always, human resources, you might still not have it outside. Keep using the notion of ventilators, because people keep saying, when are you going to get the next 10, 20, 25 ventilators? But if you don't have the resources for that, then you're going to go around in circles and still not have enough human resources to keep people ventilated. At the end of the day, what we want to do is avoid people from getting to a ventilation mechanism. And I think the other element we have found is that we need to do an ongoing educational process, because it's not going to go anywhere. You still are finding people that are not willingly coming to get tested. Some communities up north where you do sweeps, people still don't want to be tested even if you're taking the testing to them. We are taking the rapid test now to A&E units, particularly up north, because that should be a quicker turnaround time to address that testing element that you are highlighting that can be a little bit more delayed when you get to Central Medical Lab.
Okay, is that it, Paul? Son. Repeat that, please. You can go ahead and repeat your question, please, Paul.
Am I being heard? Am I being
Yes.
heard?
Go ahead.
He got disconnected.
Okay, we'll go ahead. We'll move on to Jules Vasquez. Jules, you're up.
They're not here. He's sleeping.
Any hearing?
Can you hear us?
Okay, we'll get. Okay.
We can't hear you.
All right, I'm hearing now.
Go ahead.
All right, so Dr. Manza, how do health professionals feel about the decision that was taken to make quarantine only a recommendation for returning Belizeans, as well as the decision to allow tourists to travel more freely within Belize? How does health workers feel about these decisions?
Well, that's an interesting question, because you have to work with what your changing epidemic is, the numbers and where you're getting your rates. I mean, if you have somebody going to Rinjawak or a particular community in Rinjawak, your risk of getting it in a local community now is different than if you had landed and you have 0 cases. So even our protocols are changing as we move along, even what we are doing at the airport, what we are doing at the land border entry points, it's changing. You know also that we went from, if you are negative still at day 14, we have been telling people who are able to go back to work, and depending on the employer and the condition where they work, that they will be able to go back to work, because as the science goes along, you're able to tweak your responses as you move along. So I think that Prime Minister explained why the decision was reached at. And it will evolve as we move along. We are having people who are exposed here, and we're still telling you to quarantine, and still people are not doing it. So and these people have never been tested, as opposed to people who arrive and have at least a test that tells you where your situation is. So I think you have to balance that, and that's how you make your decision.
Thank you, Paul. We have to move along now. Jules Vasquez is up next. Just hold on.
You're muted, Jules.
Just let me unmute you, Jules.
Doc, good morning. in
Belize
Belize
because
because
it went
it
into
went into
full
full
stride. The
stride. The
audio was
audio was
completely
completely
lost during
lost
that.
during that time, and I think it's important how this Mexican research illustrates what's happening, or may illustrate what's happening in northern Belize with these high numbers.
I think I read that article, part of the article on Wednesday, and immediately shared it with the team on Wednesday. So they're going to go back and review where these samples were particularly taken for. But they are making mention of Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico as having a viral mutation that is having a greater infectivity. So that would explain why perhaps your RT and RO numbers would be higher. If you recall, maybe 4 months ago, Chetumal had a RT of 7. That means one person was infecting 7 others. And that was a flag for Mexican authorities because that was way above the average. Globally, you have an RT which is usually 1 to 3. But having 1 to 7, and in Belize we had done 1 to 5 maybe about 2 months ago. So this could start to explain where that is coming from. We have to go back and review the data to see where they gathered this. But this was published by a team from Oaxaca.
Okay, I'm not hearing you anymore. So you're saying that it's a stronger strain. So good, I appreciate that. Would you give? I don't know if you can hear me, but would you give an update on the numbers at the prison? Would you give an update on the numbers at the prison? You just gave Coast Guard and BDF. Would you speak about the prison? And then, since I know I'll be shut down after this, would you also speak about if this, we're seeing how the tests are returning with 25%, in general, 20 to 30% of the tests being taken right now are returning with a positive result. You had said that September would lead to a spike in infections. Is this that September bump so unfortunate? Would you discuss those things?
Well, we had said the first 7 to 10 days of October is when we anticipated whatever may have happened that long weekend in September. What we're noticing of that 27% positivity rate per day is driven by bigger clusters. The BDF, the Coast Guard, those outbreaks in those facilities, which is what you anticipate can happen if there's not eternal precautions being taken. And so I anticipate that when you do sweeps of Belisario, fair weather camp, you're going to have higher numbers. In terms of the prison, the last note I have is it was 8 prisoners and 8 prison guards and security that had tested positive, and I know they had done sweeps of the particular areas where they had identified initial cases.
Thank you. We'll now go to Kirani Anderson from CTV3.
Isani, has happened in Orange Walk is that persons, the index case, if you will, sometimes it's not easy to pinpoint. But what you're finding is when you're able to identify an index case, just like situation at the Coast Guard, it's usually with contact with somebody from outside. And then, of course, you come together to a common environment where you're doing training, where you're having social activities, where you sit down and eat at the same time. Then there's a tendency to obviously not wear a mask all the time because you're in a bigger group. So that's what is triggering the outbreaks. That's what triggered it in the spread in Orange Walk. Then we assume that this was happening in Belisario camp. As I said, the team went there to do an initial scouting exercise yesterday, and they are going in now to do testing of all the other persons. Similar situation happened at Coast Guard. So the outbreak is usually brought from somebody outside, and then in a common environment, it's easier to spread.
My second question has to do with the quarantine facility in Mountain Pine Ridge. Earlier this week, I had asked you for an update on the situation there, and you had mentioned that a swabbing exercise was conducted at the facility a week ago. This is Camp De Silva. Can you provide us with an update on the situation in respect of the results? Because we're still hearing persons complaining, and we're seeing videos and what have you being sent to the media in respect of the treatment of individuals presently being detained there.
Went 1 week ago. We were looking for the people who had been there for 14 days, who had come as part of what has been labeled as the ICE flight, where people being deported back to Belize. Those results, as far as I know, came back around 5 o'clock yesterday evening. So the team at Belmopan should have signed on, and once we get the result, we give it to National Security, and then people follow the due process after that. So all those persons should be cleared today. The ones who were swabbed 1 week ago, then that is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, can we just run to the next person? So, okay, we'll go back with Ms. Anderson. Go ahead. Hold on, I don't know which.
She's muted. You're muted.
Can you unmute your mic, please?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, Dr. Manzanero. Is there any information that you can share with us regarding the recent COVID death that was recorded here in the north?
Northern Regional 2, Cartution on Sunday. It's a male in his late 60s. He was not able to keep what's supplemental oxygen that's available at the region. That's the reason why he was referred. When he was brought here, he wasn't intubated. Up to the last report I had gotten, he was on high nasal flow of oxygen. But as we are noticing, people who have died as a result of COVID-19 may not necessarily die as a result of respiratory failure. If you have other conditions such as high blood pressure or cardiac condition, then what we are seeing is that COVID-19 accelerates the formation of clots, blood clots, so that people are more likely to have heart attacks and massive strokes. The review of our data suggests that up to 60% of our patients may not have been, the ones who have died then, would not have had been ventilated at all.
Okay, my second question, I know you mentioned that private facilities will now be allowed to test for COVID-19. Can you elaborate on the process that those facilities will undergo in terms of passing on that information to the Ministry of Health?
Private facilities from the beginning have been doing swabbing for the Ministry of Health. They don't do the actual test, they send it to us for processing. Everybody getting a PCR test in a private facility is getting it with us. We had discussions with at least 3 facilities that if they wanted to move to a rapid test structure, they must follow the specific algorithm of the Ministry of Health, and they would be allowed to do testing with the specific validated test, which now is only the SD biosensor. So once private facilities meet that requirement, and the ones who want to set up a PCR, once they meet the requirements as stipulated by the Central Medical Lab, that should not be a process. We already have a reporting mechanism in place where we have a direct communication with them. So we don't think the reporting process should be A problem, we would be more concerned with the quality notes that they are able to provide in terms of the process flow. And before I forget, because I don't think we ever made mention of that, the external quality control samples that were taken from the lab in the initial part of the epidemic, which went on to WHO for international validation and accreditation. 100% of those samples met the quality assurance requirements established by WHO.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to Ms. Renee Trujillo now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this question would be for Dr. Manza or the PM, but earlier the PM mentioned about, so let me see if I can find it here, in terms of the safe corridor protocols and the 10-day quarantine for Belizeans, that we would then go from having some sort of mandatory prosecution or fine to recommendations. Recommendations would be from who and based on what? What would be the guideline for those recommendations?
Recommendations in terms of how many days of quarantine you should keep after you have been potentially exposed is 10 days, because the average amount of days after exposure when you're going to start developing signs and symptoms is hovering between 5 to 7 days. So that the recommendation is 10 days, because even if you are positive and asymptomatic, after 10 days you are no longer going to be an infectious person. So that's the reason why that specific 10-day change has been made, not only in terms of the safety corridor, but even in terms of when we are asking people to quarantine. It's based on science.
Okay, and then this next question is for the Prime Minister. PM, amid the Okay, well, I'm good with that then.
Of which 250 workers, and yet, hear you correctly, it seems that the majority of these people got infected outside the workplace. Is it something they did, or just is it the nature of the infection? Can you explain that?
People we have as active cases, just to clarify, the total number of active cases that we know of is 1,029. The numbers I gave in terms of soldiers, police officers, coast guards, and healthcare workers doesn't mean that all of them are active. The numbers I gave are people who have been infected from the beginning. Most of them have recovered, right? I just was highlighting how it can affect frontline workers outside of the workplace. I mean, why does this happen? Well, I think the same mechanism that's infecting others would be applicable to frontline workers. So you may be, and I think we had discussions when we met with Coast Guard, when we met with immigration officers, if you're only being cautious or extra cautious as a frontline worker when you're at work, but at the end of your work shift, you go and have a party or have socialization and or go to a bar or go to a restaurant and socializing with people, then your risk is going to be there then. So that's why I said up to 85% of our healthcare workers at least have been exposed outside of the workplace. They have not been infected by a patient or in their line of duty.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. And then one final question having to do with the COVAX vaccine plan. I missed the figure that we had made down payment on to join that plan, and then I think it's 2 million more that we owe. But the question I wanted to ask is in terms of the protocol for administering a vaccine once we get one, which is not anytime soon, is I think the recommendation is to have frontline workers go first, and then the most vulnerable population. Is that something that the ministry has looked at?
Be a difficult situation for us. It's going to follow what other international protocols are. It will mimic what we are currently doing with the flu vaccines, of which we have 40,000 doses, which means healthcare workers go first. Then you have to look for the vulnerable population, people older than 60. The flu vaccine, I'm using that as an example. Children under 23 months, pregnant women, hypertensive, diabetic, kidney failure patients, HIV patients, cancer patients, and that's how your list is expanded. So we do that with the flu. I don't think we have ever, since I can recall, been using the full 40,000 doses that we routinely procure, that we procure this year. There's a 10% increase this year as compared to previous years. So I don't know if even if we would have available 120,000 doses, whether we would have that uptake in terms of usage. But it would be for 30% of the population. The initial down payment is $382,000 US that have been paid, and the remaining $2.1 million is payable once the vaccines are available.
Thank you. Dr. Manzanero, we have one final question. Krem wasn't able to get online, so I have a question from them. Will consideration be given for rapid tests for those being repatriated through the land borders?
Yeah, but I have a feeling that countries are not routinely requiring rapid tests. Like Guatemala says a PCR test. And just to put it in the context as well, Belizeans who are in these countries are having difficulty getting a PCR test in those home countries. So it's not that easy. In European countries, if you're not symptomatic, you cannot get a PCR test. So it's not that easy. We're trying to facilitate in as much as we can.
Thank you, Dr. Manzanero. I know you have prior commitments you have to get to, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. No, we'll continue with the press conference. We'll turn it over to Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Health, Dr. George Hoff.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Good morning, Prime Minister. I want to start by just reinforcing what my colleague, the Director of Health Services, shared with you guys. First of all, our inventory up to yesterday is 20,000 PCR tests available. And if we're going to be doing an average of, say, 270, 300 tests a day, well, you can do the math. It's going to hold us for another 70 days. With that said, we are all aware also that we have the 13,000 biosensor rapid antigen tests, and PAHO in this week, like the director said, is delivering another 10,000. So that should put us at a comfortable 23,000 rapid antigen tests from the biosensor community. And also we have moved ahead to secure funds to procure an additional 20,000 tests from the Abbott platform, which that process has started. Now, if we look at the airport scenario where most people are coming with their PCR, and it's going to at least alleviate a little bit of the load when it comes to the rapid test. So I think in the next couple of months, having an inventory of 40,000 plus tests should give us a few months to be able to see if protocols will change and how we will be dealing with this testing structure in the months to come within the region. I'm sure the exploration of the airline industry with their rapid tests also is going to add a layer for us to be able to mitigate some of that expense, because they are looking at a rapid PCR test. I just want to clarify that they're looking at a rapid PCR test and not a rapid antigen test. Now, looking at the Corozal Memorial Hospital, we have continued to give them full support with full subvention. That institution has not lost any of its subventions that they used to before the COVID pandemic. Also, we have given them support to infrastructure when it comes to modifications that had to be done. And we have been quietly giving them support when it comes to equipment. Presently, we're looking at small infrastructure expansions to be able to handle and hold patients that are waiting for results, because sometimes we misinterpret the numbers that are actually at Corozal waiting for result as patients within the COVID tertiary unit. So we have to be careful. For example, they had a number of 8 patients in that unit yesterday or today, but not all of them, some were waiting for results. So that has been That has been discussed, and presently we are discussing how we can secure a separate area for them to support them. When it comes to the response compensation that the Honorable Prime Minister promised a few months back, that has been done in its initial stage, and that has been given out to both the Corozal Memorial Hospital and to the community and regional hospitals directly related to the frontline workers. One of the things I want to go on record and be clear is that these lists were formulated by the regional managers, the epidemiological team, and obviously with some of the workers within the regions, and some employees at this time might have not been included because when the initial lists were done, they were not in the COVID structure or in the COVID roster. Now I know we'll have to deal with that issue because we have a few of them that have been now working COVID the last 2-3 weeks that were not put on that initial list. So I just want to bring that to the attention. When it comes to the PPEs and supplies, the Ministry of Finance, along with the government of Belize, has been extremely generous in giving us the full support. We have managed to continue to procure to the point that we enjoy probably an excess of 6 to 9 months supplies, even with a full-blown scenario, which nobody wants. But at this time, we have managed to shore up a bit more when it comes to reusable part, like soap, alcohol, hand sanitizer, when it comes to Clorox, when it comes to all the cleaning aids, when it comes to the masks, the disposable masks, the gongs, the gloves, because we are also tasked to supply also the elections and boundaries for the incoming nomination and election day. So we have been doing that quietly with the full support to that department. When we move on now to the support of the equipment, all the extension of equipment we bought in the first tranche that I explained to you all in the last 2 or 3 press conferences, those have arrived. We are presently now signed off and waiting for a tranche of $2.6 million through an IDE fund that we bought from 7 different suppliers, which is a list of gamut of equipment which goes from patient monitors, infusions, electrocardiograms, laryngoscopes. We're also getting an additional 20 ventilators, again with caution because we might get ventilators, but we will not be able to have the full gamut of human resource to run these ventilators. We're getting an additional 63 beds. We have brought in 66 about 2 weeks ago. And the list is long. Ultrasound, C-arms, quite a few equipment for all the regional hospitals, community hospitals, and some support also to the Corozal Memorial Hospital. With this also, we moved ahead to secure funding from through IDB to make that deposit for the vaccines. I just want to correct a little number here. We really went ahead and procured 238,000 vaccines, really, instead of the 130. We put in for 238,800 vaccines. We made the deposit, like both the DHS and the Prime Minister alluded to, and we have secured through the IDB funding for the year 2021 to be able to come up with the other balance of 2.1 million US. So that has been put in place already. Now moving on to one of the key things that people always keep asking me about is human resource. We have employed close to about 18 doctors since the pandemic has started. Why we don't see the numbers right away? Because I send 3, I send 4, then I send 3. As I go getting them, I go employing them. Nurses, the DHS was correct, 1920, and we have rehired even the ones that their contract had come to an end, or the ones that had already served their time and would not be eligible for employment. We also managed to re-employ them. In fact, I can't find enough nurses to employ if I could employ them. We have moved on also to employ whoever which are trained in the labs, the lab technicians. We have employed as much as we could have found. One of the key things I think is important also as we move on beside the human resource portion of it is that we are already low when it comes to certain regions, and what this has done is this has come to fill our demand between our flu clinics. I keep reminding all my colleagues that we created a separate department. We created a flu clinic beside our outpatient clinic, beside our hospital, so the rosters all of a sudden grew by 30%. And then the demand on the overtime also grew by 30%. So what we have done within the regions is that we have moved from the 8-hour shift to a 12-hour shift, and that has been able to mitigate a bit of the overtime and bring it down. Now this comes as a huge sacrifice and cost of the healthcare workers. I'm asking you, instead of working 8 hours a day, to work 12 hours. Yes, you're compensated. Yes, we probably ask you to do 4 days in a week. to hold the amount of hours for the week. But most of the times, people will not go to work 4 days a week. They will go to full 5, 6 days a week. But that human resource challenge has remained, and I must proudly say that we have been able to keep it, and the staff has been very, very responsible. The staff has been able to hold their end. And with that, I want to just declare, leave this morning, Prime Minister, is that at this point, we have total support, we have total logistics, we have total resources when it comes to all the PPEs that is required for the next 3 to 6 months in different categories to face this pandemic.
We'll have the chair of the COVID-19 National Task Force, Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation, and Poverty Alleviation, Ms. Judith L. Puche.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues at the head, Prime Minister and colleagues at the head table. Good morning to the media and to the listening and viewing audience. I just wanted to focus on a few areas just to update people on how we're progressing in terms of dealing with the non-medical aspects, if you will, of the pandemic. Just to share information on PDIA, there's quite a bit of activity there. I know quite a bit of interest. You have heard the Prime Minister talk about the relaxation in terms of having people come in, making it easier. At the PGIA, I really want to start by going on record to publicly thank the BACC for partnering with us, for really working with us in terms of ensuring that we could make the infrastructural and other changes that were needed to ensure people's safety and protection as they came in and out of the airport, as well as want to congratulate and thank the team that's up there, that multi-agency team that really has been doing an excellent job and really stepping up their game over time, working within the confines of what we have in terms of human resources, in terms of, there's just finite infrastructure, and people have really been doing their utmost best to ensure that the process flows that we set up, that we walk the media through prior to the opening of the airport. And so people were able to see that those process flows work to optimum. And so we have been able to cope fairly well with the passengers that have been coming in. Over the past 2 weeks, these 2 opening weeks, if you will, we've processed through 1,713 arriving passengers. And there's quite a number of people going out as well. But focusing on the arriving passengers from various, the commercial lifts that come in from United and American Airlines, and now TAV International has been added on to that list of carriers, as well as the private flights that come in. The team has been able to process through those flights now. We're processing under 2 hours that they're able to clear the flights. And there are a number of issues at play there, or issues that assist in the optimizing or really helping us to clear with that level of efficiency. The DHS hinted at the fact that a number of people are coming in, quite a number of people are coming in with their 72-hour-old PCRs. So that helps in terms of fast-tracking people. As well, the Travel and Health app, and people filling in that Travel and Health app 72 hours prior to coming in helps to expedite the process, because that means by the time the person lands, their information is already accessible by the Ministry of Health. And in terms of being able, those people that need to be processed, to be tested, that information is already available. They can plan ahead. The Ministry of Health can anticipate and even label people's vials and swabs, etc., to be able to process them through more efficiently. So the Travel and Health app has really been of great assistance also in terms of being able to process through very efficiently. Apart from that, we'll see increases in efficiency, because the Customs Department, they have a new screening machine that landed last week, and their technician is on the ground from the company, training people as well as installing the machinery. So that will help in terms of being able to safely and efficiently screen baggage, replacing the small screening machine that was there on loan. So we'll see increases in efficiency there as well. And just in time, because we are seeing that there will be more commercial airlines coming in very shortly. Delta is set to come in around November 20th. We just got word that United is about to resume their flight out of Denver in mid-December. Avianca was due to come in there push back to December, but December is right around the corner. And then we have Southwest coming in January. So we're looking at all that to ensure that we can deal with the increased volumes. And I think that measures such as I have described, as well as the fact that American Airlines will be looking at this pre-boarding testing, will help immensely in ensuring that we can cope and be just as efficient with the increased numbers that we're expecting. So that continues to be a work under review and progress and process that is constantly, we constantly review the flows, recalibrate where it's necessary, and look towards making the necessary adjustments so that we can continue with the same level of efficiency and safety. As I said, the travel health app has been very useful in terms of efficiency. We have been able to work out a lot of the bugs, and again, that's a continued discussion between the developers of that app, which is a crack team out of the Statistical Institute of Belize. You have a number of very young and talented IT specialists there that have really developed this app and continue to refine the app with support from CETA and the team from the Ministry of Health. So it's an ongoing discussion. We've worked out a lot of the bugs. What we're working on right now is to get it on the Google Play platform. And that has taken some doing. Apple was more open, and as we all know, it's already on that platform, in the Apple Store. But Google, we have had to really work on the changing requirements, to be quite honest. I guess they have their own experiences with COVID-19 apps. And so we've been working in ensuring that we fulfill all their requirements. So we're expecting that we're at the point where we have fulfilled all the requirements and just awaiting their go-ahead in terms of the app going on the Play Store. But nonetheless, it continues to be on the COVID-19.bz website, downloadable as a AKP app. I'm learning all the IT language, just sitting in these meetings with these very bright young people, very bright and astute young people. So nonetheless, people still, we provide support at the airport for especially people who are not as savvy in terms of the technology, older persons, persons with disabilities. Those are the few people that we're noting that we need to support in registering on the app. And of course, the added benefits that the app provides in terms of being able to have the Ministry of Health access information with the geographic tracking information if anything goes awry, in terms of people being able to register if they're feeling ill, etc. So that's an ongoing process, but I think that we're at a very good place. And we're certainly not getting the feedback of complaints, because that's usually a good measure that it's working. So as we know with these apps, it's a continuous work in terms of working out the bugs, updating, etc. And that app has potential beyond just what it's being used for right now, particularly in this COVID-19 environment, because it will be the gateway into us going paperless insofar as the entry requirements into Belize. The next phase of development will be around the entry and departure forms and the custom forms being put on that app, so that the entry can be paperless and seamless. So we're really trying to see how we can push this technology. There are also other parts around. There's a survey that is done in the tourism sector to look at tourists coming in, what they're spending on. This survey providing rich data for us to be able to recalibrate and to use data to inform the development of our tourism product. So that's another use. So just to say that since we have this excellent platform, we're going to look at how we can expand the use as much as possible, really push in seeing how we can get full bang for the buck out of this technology. And the Ministry of Tourism is leading in this regard, in pushing in those areas that I talked about, along with stakeholders, and also we're getting good funding support from the IDB in trying to make these pieces work. As the Prime Minister talked about, the whole issue of really focusing on personal responsibility as a key factor in the fight against this pandemic. We're really looking at, how do we push towards ensuring heightened public awareness. And to answer the question about where do the recommendations, etc., come from, it will be the same scientific public health, scientifically based recommendations that have been made from the Ministry of Health. We are refreshing the public service announcements, trying to refine the message, working along with risk communicators, some people who are volunteering, some people from Barrow, some people from the Ministry of Health, making sure that we can translate information, make information more available to people. So then focus will be not on penalties, but how does the government provide the guidelines, the information to people, and then people will have to take it on and really make those kinds of personal choices and decisions that they need to make themselves and to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. Hence the reason why we will still continue to provide the information to people coming in at the airport on recommending that the good practice is for you to quarantine for 10 days. And these are tips and these are the guidelines as to how you can do that safely, and helping people to understand that particularly if you're going into a scenario at home as a returning Belizean or whatever, where there are people who are at risk, that it's something that you should take into consideration. So to give you information for you to look at your personal situation and really take that those kinds of personal decisions and steps, because that COVID-19 will be with us for a while, and we really have to start to look at integrating this information into and translating it into behavior change. So there's going to be a lot of focus. You've already seen the stepping up of the public service announcements, the refreshing of information, because I know that sometimes when these things repeat, people it kind of becomes background noise. So there's been a lot of emphasis over the past couple of weeks on doing that, as well as looking at other strategies to get the information out to other populations. So apart from different languages, translating things into Spanish, into Quechua, into Garifuna, and we've gotten good support from Barrow on this, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has used their resources. Getting on the ground into communities to provide them with the information that's more targeted. So there's a lot of focus in that regard. And also on providing those guidelines that I talked about, for the various businesses and sectors. The public service has its guidelines. We're looking at working. There have been various sectors that have been proactive in promulgating or bringing to the fore to the NOC their own guidelines. We will hear and we know of the gold standard guidelines, which is at its core about COVID-19 compliance in the tourism sector. That is what it is at its core. So to continue working with the various sectors to ensure that people have guidelines that are able to, and you're able to operate safely, that businesses have the information as to what kind of measures they need to take to be able to operate safely. So that will be a lot of the focus of the it's already the focus, and we will be ramping up the public information, public awareness, as well as working on the guidelines for business continuity or operating your business or your sector within the COVID-19 environment. I just want to make one other point to say that the PGIA is open and we see the changes there. But the land borders remain closed, except to certain categories. So in exiting for departures, people still have to seek clearance and permission from the immigration department, and if it is that you have a medical condition and that is why you want to exit, from the Director of Health Services, from the Ministry of Health also. And in coming in, there is still a coordinated entry where there are times allotted, so it's Monday to Friday from 10 to 12 that people can come in through the land borders. And the reason for that is, of course, the human resource limitations, particularly on the part of health, because health does not have a constant presence at the land borders. And so in setting time, we allow the Ministry of Health to have the most efficient use of its very scarce human resources. So in a nutshell, those are the major areas that we have been focusing on, the non-medical areas from the task force.
Thank you, CEO Abuche. We will now hear from Director of the Belize Tourism Board, Mrs. Karen Bevins.
Good morning, everyone. Prime Minister and colleagues at the head table, members of the media, good morning again. All right, let me start by adding to what CEO Alpuche mentioned with the airport arrival and say how pleased and encouraged we in the tourism industry are with the positive feedback we have been getting on the arrival process. Our stakeholders have been providing feedback from their guests. Our own Belizeans have been giving us feedback and adding as well some suggestions for improvement and enhancement to the process as well. And I'm sure that they have seen that we have adopted some of the suggestions made so far to enhance the process. So again, thanks for that. We want to extend our appreciation, and we would like to encourage further feedback for us to improve even further. With that said, while we are pleased with the feedback of the arrival process, we have been receiving concerns from stakeholders on feedback from guests with the restrictions in movement within Belize. The Prime Minister mentioned the same earlier, and as a result, the relaxation in the restrictions are, of course, great news to the tourism industry. But while that is great news, we also want to be mindful of the fact that persons are traveling, but the consideration on safety or the factor of safety is their number one consideration in choosing a destination. With that said then, moving forward, we plan to expand the safe corridor to include all tourism gold standard certification business within the tourism industry. As you're aware, we already have the gold standard program for our hotels and tour operators. And to date, we have received around 300 applications from hotels, with 200 being approved and uploaded on our website already. And tour operators applications, we received 175, with 140 being approved and uploaded on the website. As you're aware, we already have the Tourism Gold Standard Certification program in place for hotels and tour operators. The plan moving forward is to adopt that program and offer it to other businesses within the tourism industry, including restaurants, tourism sites. We have car rentals and taxis that have already been trained and certified, and adding gift shops as well. Once that is done, then we plan to encourage all businesses operating within the tourism industry to become gold standard certified. Earlier, the Prime Minister mentioned that there are no penalties for non-compliance, but I must say there are benefits to becoming tourism gold standard certified, because the BTB intends to partner solely with gold standard certified entities in our marketing. For example, we quite often arrange, and in fact we are arranging now, virtual farm trips or virtual press trips, and we intend to partner and include all those that are gold standard certified, particularly because the travelers are looking for safety, and we want to ensure that when we market Belize as a destination that has implemented the protocols for safety, we want to ensure that when the travelers arrive in Belize, that we deliver on the promise. And hence the reason BTB will continue to partner and market along with entities, businesses, hotels, tour operators, and all those that have become tourism gold standard certified, or in the case of taxis where they are not fully gold standard, but they are certified and trained by the BTB as well. Again, I would like to add in the area of airlift to what CEO Alpucha mentioned, that we also received last week word from American Airlines that the direct flights from Los Angeles, Dallas, and Charlotte should commence in December as well. So we are getting positive news on the airlift. Following this press conference, we plan to provide information to the stakeholders on the process that will be used to offer gold standard certification program to restaurants and tourism sites, gift shops, and the taxis and car rentals. That information will be released early next week and uploaded on the BTB website as well, as to how they could become tourism gold standard certified. To give a little indication of where we are with cruise tourism, we had formed, or the America's Cruise Task Force has been formed, and that is the overarching task force to implement protocols for worldwide for cruise tourism. From there, we formed a regional task force, of which Belize is a member of the Central American Region Task Force. I should go back and mention that the overall task force, which is the Americas Task Force, is chaired by the Prime Minister of Barbados, along with the president of one of the cruise lines. In the case of the regional task force, of which Belize is a member, that is chaired by the Prime Minister of Honduras, and the Belize Tourism Board's cruise director is representing Belize on that task force. From there, we have since formed a local Belize cruise task force, which will work together similar to the task force chaired by CEO Alpuche, and the cruise task force is also chaired by CEO Alpuche. We will develop local protocols for cruise, which will become an integral part of the regional task force, which I guess will move on to the overarching task force of the Americas. That's the plan. The no-sale order for cruise have been extended by the CDC to October 31st. We do know that the CDC had recommended an extension to February. However, I guess from objections from the cruise lines, they have agreed to extend it up to October 31st. So that is where we are in cruise today. But from the fact the CDC was recommending to extend to February, I guess indications or hints like those are what gives us some kind of guidelines to plan towards. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Thank you, Director, Ms. Bevins. We'll now open the floor.
Before the questions, I just wanted to say, in terms of the overall articulation of what the changes will be, when I, at the start, gave some indication, I did not specifically say that, for example, restaurants across the country, where we were or where we are currently, as you know, that restaurants can only operate for dining in services with a maximum of 10 persons, 10 customers at any time in the restaurant. We're changing that so that, in fact, depending on your square footage, depending on your space, you can have more than 10 persons in the restaurant at the same time. You have to have the tables set apart so that you observe the social distancing protocol. And you can't have more than 10 persons at any one table. 10 persons of the same party can be at a table together, but that number can't exceed 10. But by and large, then, countrywide, restaurants are not any longer going to be restricted in a sort of open or clear fashion without restriction, a sort of inflexible fashion, to only having 10 persons. No, you can go above 10 if you have the space to accommodate more than 10. Again, in terms of moving about, we had first said, or we currently say in the essay that's going to be changed, that when the tourists come in, they must be transported to their hotel or tourist accommodation by any means of transportation provided directly by that hotel or tourist accommodation. Well, we had agreed before Wednesday with the Car Rental Association that a tourist coming in who is not going, or perhaps certainly not going to the Keys, who may be wanting to drive to Placencia or certainly wanting to drive to the Cayo district, would be allowed to rent a vehicle from the car rental agencies that are stationed at the airport. The itinerary would be agreed with the renters, and a tracking device would be put on the car so that if people go outside of the itinerary that's agreed with the car rentals, that could easily be discovered, and the BTB could be told of that breach, if you will, of the agreement. I think in terms of the actual changes to be made, that or those clarifications to what I had earlier headlined are sufficient for me to feel that I've given you as complete a picture as I can within this context. Naturally, the Attorney General will do his thing perhaps on Saturday to go through the changes and indeed the entire new SI line by line or provision by provision. So with that, Dorian, I am certainly happy now to take questions, as I believe all of us at the table are.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister. We'll once again begin with Paul.
All right. Good morning, AM, once again to the table. So my first question is something that is in relation to something that was not touched upon when it has to do with COVID. Has a decision been taken on whether or not COVID-19 positive patients and persons in quarantine at the time will be able to vote in the upcoming general elections? And are there protocols in place or being planned out as to how that will happen if it will be permitted?
Fortunately, Paul, it can't be permitted. If you are COVID positive, you're supposed to be in quarantine, either at a government facility or at your own home. There's no way we can get around that restriction, which is a legal one, which is a mandatory one. And if we were to try to change the law to make arrangements to accommodate COVID positive persons who wish to vote, not only would it be, I think, an extremely difficult logistical exercise, I suspect that the fears of those that are not positive, but who already have reservations or are perhaps in two minds about whether they will exercise the franchise, those fears would become even more pronounced. So while it is extremely regrettable that if you're COVID positive, in effect, you're not able to exercise your franchise, we don't see that it can be otherwise.
With close to 1,000 infected Belizeans, and that number may increase, hopefully it decreases. Can you perhaps comment on how this decision may affect the results of the upcoming general elections?
No, I can't. I would be speculating and guessing in the same way as you would be. Remember that we, the authorities, except for the health team, don't even know the names of the COVID positive people. We can disaggregate, and so that we can know in terms of all the active cases where the numbers are. In other words, how many active cases are in Orange Walk, how many active cases are in Corozal. But when you start going village by village, it becomes a little bit more problematic. In any event, I don't know if anybody would try to do that sort of an exercise, anybody in officialdom, because I'm not sure what would be the point of doing such an exercise. I'm afraid in terms of those that are COVID positive and will not be able to vote, in a sense, how it will affect the elections really is a matter of the roll of the dice. I don't think I can take it beyond that at all, Paul.
In terms of the decision to give restaurants the way to accommodate patrons based on square footage, my question is, why hasn't churches been given the same consideration once we have adequate square footage?
Well, because, Paul, and I perhaps need to be very careful here. First of all, there are these smaller churches that we seem to have a problem with in terms of compliance with the current situation. Also, the question of exhalations in terms of the choir singing and the pastor preaching, and the fact of what is now confirmed to be transmission by aerosolization, if I can use that term. Those sorts of considerations, I believe, informed the decision of the NOC not to extend that same kind of relaxation or liberalization to the churches. Do understand, though, that this kind of thing is always under review. The Belize Council of Churches has representation on the NOC in the person of Reverend Anela Moore, and you can rest assured that she is extremely conscientious in trying to ensure that, in fact, the churches are not left behind whenever we contemplate any kind of liberalization. So, for now, the position remains the same with the churches, but I stress that it is under continuing review.
My final question here is, what becomes of the NOC, National Oversight Committee, and the regulations in place, considering that moving to a general election, and possibly, there will be a new government, considering that you're moving out. But what becomes of regulations be up in the air? How do we move forward with determining the next steps in terms of COVID-19 safety measures once we get into the full swing of elections and we get past?
What's going to become of the NOC? That will be a decision for the new administration. I am here today because I certainly mean to discharge that aspect of my continuing duties, even though I'm only a caretaker Prime Minister. I certainly mean to the very last to try to ensure that I carry out my responsibility. As I said to you, the NOC is likely to meet. Perhaps we normally meet on Mondays. We met Wednesday this week because Monday was a holiday. Perhaps to the extent where we would actually have a meeting on Monday before the Wednesday's general elections. That certainly would be the last meeting that I would chair. And what happens to the NOC after the election results are known and a new administration is sworn in is a matter for that new administration. The laws that are in place, the statutory instruments, would continue to be in place unless and until the new administration decides either to amend them or revoke them. Again, that has to be a decision ultimately for that new administration.
So just for clarity's sake here, just for clarity's sake, so we're saying that businesses like Barrow and churches and gyms and these places that are limited at this time, if regulations does not change within the next weeks, that they will essentially have to pay until the elections are over and not settled.
Yes, in fact, you're absolutely correct. I stress the point that you made, though. We are constantly reviewing the situation, so there is no reason for anybody to think that inflexibly what is now in place will last until the general elections. There may be some additional changes. The question of the gyms, as I've told you, we're at a point where we think we're close to some kind of agreement that would see the reopening of the gyms. But if indeed it turns out that the NOC does not make any decision to change anything that's currently in place or that will be in place after Sunday night, then it just stays there and continues to govern the situation until the new administration makes its decision as to what it wants to keep and what it wants to get rid of.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jules Vasquez, you're up. Just unmute there.
Good morning. First of all, Mr. Prime Minister, are you able to speak about the opening of schools? A lot of attention is being paid to opening of the tourism sector and to business, but I'm certain you will know that distance learning is not what in-class learning is, as any teacher will tell you. And also what is the greatest concern is that it breaks along socioeconomic lines, that children with the least access to space, to technology, to phones even, to do their work, are the ones suffering the most. So, you know, it's creating a really distorted school year. Now, allow me, I know that it would be politically unpopular to say open schools because everyone is so concerned about children. Absolutely, that's understood. But is the political dimension of this really driving the decision-making in the school's process when we know, any teacher can tell you at any school, that children are being left out and the poorest children are the ones that are suffering the most?
Don't quarrel with your assessment at all, but the consequences of the pandemic are widespread, and the disruption and the disadvantaging of various sectors is almost unlimited. So while I particularly sympathize with your analysis regarding schools, they're not by any means singular sufferers. Coming to the question of any decision to in fact reopen schools, let me say this. I just had a message 2 or so days ago from the president of the BNTU, the Belize National Teachers Union, asking if in fact the NOC would contemplate pulling back from the current situation in which teachers are asked to physically go to school to prepare the lessons that later on are given out or are prepare the work that's distributed to the children via whatever means they use. President Smith is saying that a number of teachers have been afflicted by COVID and that it is the considered view of the union and of the teachers they represent that teachers should not even be asked to go to school with the schools being empty, except for the teachers, with the classrooms being empty, not to do any kind of teaching, but just to do the organization of the workload. So it strikes me that you're not going to get any support at all from certainly the unionized teachers in terms of the call for the physical reopening of schools. Now, the private schools are another matter, but again, I think while there's nothing to say that we can't be flexible, in the normal course, you would want uniformity in terms of this whole policy of whether or not schools are to reopen. I would think then that given certainly that last position I had from President Elena Smith, the NOC is not likely, but I certainly don't slam the door shut. I can't usurp what really is the decision-making process of the NOC, but my best guess is that once they are made aware of the position of the BNTU, and I've been asked by the President to put this to the NOC, I don't see that the likelihood is very high that there will be any decision to physically reopen schools anytime soon.
Okay. I know my questions are limited, so I'm reluctant to waste on this, for which I know what the answer will be. But is there any contemplation of opening the borders, the land borders, and is the contemplation of not opening it, is that bearing in mind the fact that a lot of merchants are saying that they have increased economic activity because people aren't going over to Chatham and spending, I'm told, as much as $20 million monthly, some people estimate. How much of the decision making on the borders is influenced by the fact that, yes, there is that health issue, but Belizeans are spending at home?
At all. One welcomes the fact that a byproduct of sealing the borders is the fact that the dollars are kept at home. In fact, on the last occasion when we spoke at one of these press conferences, you made the point that the GDP decline was not as steep as, or as precipitous as we had feared. And I thought that certainly in terms of the overall economic activity, the fact that people were not able to go freely across the borders and spend Belizean dollars abroad must have helped in that context. So it is a welcome side effect of the decision to close the borders. I was going to say seal, but obviously they're not sealed since so many people are able to go by way of the illegal crossings. But while we appreciate, or while the merchants certainly appreciate the fact that it has meant that our dollars have to be kept at home, that is not part of the equation in terms of the NOC's decision making at all. It is strictly on the basis of the health considerations.
Okay, and sir, and then would you speak about the country's finances, the state of the reserves, and also the domestic borrowing that continues to happen for government to continue to meet its wage bill and meet its operational costs, and obviously the ballooning debt to GDP ratio?
Well, it is a fact that there is a ballooning of the debt to GDP ratio. It is a fact that we continue to borrow from the central bank to meet our wage bill and our operating expenses. There is some comfort to be had from what seems to be now the revised thinking of the international financial institutions and even the IMF. There seems to be almost a prescription, a complete turnabout with respect certainly to the fund, the IMF, a prescription to say that people have no choice but to borrow their way out of the economic disaster that is the consequence of the pandemic. Now, they are also suggesting that the international community will have to look at some form of debt forgiveness with respect to bilateral and multilateral debt. I'm not quite sure how far that will go. With respect to their pronouncement that continued borrowing is the only way to go, they do draw a distinction between those countries that are able to borrow freely on the international commercial markets and those that have to limit the borrowing to multilateral borrowing, because clearly there is a limit to the resources that especially small countries are going to be able to get from the multilateral community. Jews, I have to hope, for the sake of whoever comes next, that indeed there will be less talk and more action on the part of the bigger countries and the international financial institutions. Remember that there was this kind of pledging conference at which a number of leaders said, oh, they would find billions of dollars to help small countries. It hasn't happened yet. Or certainly the pledges that have actually come in are far smaller than the amount that is being aimed at. I don't know additionally of any multilateral financial institution that has said to any small country, certainly they haven't said it to Belize, that there does appear in like the poorest of the poor, sub-Saharan Africa, and those places I think are already being cut some sort of slack. But for people, for countries such as Belize, so far it's all talk, it's all rhetoric, and no action. I have to hope that indeed there will be substantial debt forgiveness on the part of the IFIs in the not too distant future, so that the new government can begin to anticipate some tangible relief. Now, what happens with respect to our domestic debt? There's no way there's likely to be any kind of relief anytime soon. And on the commercial front, internationally, that super bond, again, in my view, we'll have no choice but to say to the commercial creditors, look, there's going to have to be a serious restructuring of the super bond. It's not something we could have done because it will take a while. It will take, as you know, protracted, complicated negotiations. But it has to be done, and that restructuring will have to entail a substantial haircut to be administered to and accepted by the bond holders. But coming back to the question of the multilaterals, while I hope and expect that at some point they will begin to agree to debt forgiveness, it was kind of hard to try to push them at this juncture, even as we're asking them for more money. But these are people who are steeped in the ways of the world and in the ways of international finance, and who recognize that this is a once-in-a-generation pandemic and disaster. And so they must know that coming down the pike, there will have to be a day of reckoning in which they are going to have to grant substantial relief on the sums that we have borrowed and continue to borrow from them. It's, I'm afraid, a poisoned chalice that's going to be handed to the new Prime Minister. But I continue to think that because the international environment will have to facilitate debt relief, will have to facilitate debt relief together with expanded financial assistance. I have to think that because when you hear about all the airlines, the airlifts that are coming back, I have to think that tourism will recover, and recover fairly quickly. I have to think that the vaccine, we just saw where is it Pfizer indicated it will be applying for emergency use authorization from the authorities in the States by the third week or so in November. I have to think that with the coming of the vaccine, with the proliferation of the rapid tests that allow us, I'm sorry, there's a feedback, that will allow us to do the kind of contact tracing that's absolutely necessary. That with all these things, we're going to come out of this thing, certainly from the health point of view, by the middle of next year. In the meantime, if our economic recovery, especially in terms of tourism, can continue apace, and you add to all that the absolute requirement that there will be for the international community and the international financial institutions to do what they have to, what they must in terms of debt relief, and we get through with the kind of restructuring, fundamental restructuring of our commercial debt that is required, that will be okay. Won't be easy, but I think we'll get there.
Thank you, Jules. We'll now move on to Ms. Kirani Anderson from CTV3.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I only have one question for you. It's in relation to the elections. As it relates to persons living across the borders, Belizeans who are registered voters, is there any discussion taking place as to having protocols being set in place to allow these persons to enter the country in sight that the land borders remain closed, or is this something that will not be entertained?
That can be entertained. No, we clearly are open to suggestions from the Elections and Boundaries Commission and the Elections and Boundaries Department. And if that sort of a proposal is made, we will have to look at it. But speaking for myself, I don't see how that can happen. These persons would, have to come with a PCR test, negative test? Would they be rapid tested at the border? We are already making a distinction between Belizeans coming back through the PGIA and Belizeans that are allowed to come back via the land borders. There are exceptions to the normal rule that you can't enter through the land borders. But the regime that governs coming back through the land borders, as it now stands, is a regime that says you've got to go into mandatory quarantine except you went for medical attention and you clearly can't be put into a quarantine facility, at which point, or as a consequence of which you'll be allowed to quarantine at home. But some form of quarantine or self-isolation is mandatory for Belizeans that even now are allowed upon application made and permission granted to come back through the land borders. You're going to scrap that if you're going to say that for those who want to come and vote, they can just come across and they do not have to quarantine. If they have to quarantine, then they can't go to vote because they should be at home. So really, ma'am, please, I understand that it's not a decision that's lightly made in terms of, in effect, depriving people of their franchise. But these are clearly extreme and unusual circumstances. So similarly to the position with people who are already here but are COVID positive, I don't see how Belizeans across the border would be allowed to come and vote.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, PM. Right. Thank you, PM.
Isani Gaetano.
Yes, good morning. Yes, good morning, PM. I have a simple question to follow up on based on a point that was raised by Paul earlier. But this has to do with the unemployment relief program and the fate of this particular initiative post the general elections. Firstly, where are we at in terms of the figures or the distribution of this kind of assistance to persons who are presently jobless?
Isani, Lord, it's on my phone, it's something like 50-odd thousand that we're dealing with in phase 2. And we're going to be able to pay out everybody and conclude phase 2 by the end of the first week in November. Now, we are still negotiating with CABE for something like $20 million to help with the unemployment relief. That's taking a little bit of time to come through. I expect that it will come through before the elections, and it may well be that I would certainly propose that we start phase 3. Clearly we'll not get very far, and it will be for the incoming administration to continue it. But if with any luck at all, we will get the 20 million or so US dollars from Kabe so that the phase 3 can start. But phase 2 will be finished at the end of in other words, everybody who's been approved will have been paid out by the end of the first week in November. Except, of course, there were like 10,000 or so persons who were longer-term unemployed that had been provided for in phase 1. They have not been provided for in phase 2. They are to move to BCAT, the Boost 2.0. As Judith will tell you, unfortunately, because of the documentation that was required, it's approved, but we don't see that starting until they pay the end of the month. We don't see that we can get all the ducks in a row to start paying them at the end of October. And so it will happen at the end of November. I hope whoever comes next will be gracious enough to acknowledge that it will be happening, because your humble servant made every effort to get the funds unlocked, including harassing the poor president of Kabe. But on a serious note, that's what's going to happen. Phase 2 will be completely taken care of by the end of the first week. We could possibly start phase 3 with just a week to go, knowing that it would then have to be continued by the incoming administration. And in terms of the longer-term unemployed, as I say, for sure they will be paid. They will be put on the BCAT, the Boost 2.0, and they will get their first payment at the end of November.
Okay, so my final follow-up question has to do. Are you hearing me? Yeah, my final follow-up question.
Until the people who are going on BCAT at the end of, and get their first payment at the end of November. In the meantime, there's going to be an effort to help them with food assistance between now and the end of November, when they collect the first Boost 2.0 paycheck.
Are you hearing me? Okay, PM, I wasn't able to hear your response, but I'll proceed with my final question nonetheless. Have we made good on collecting those monies that you've mentioned in previous occasions that we would have been borrowing from the multinationals, the IFIs and these other programs who have been assisting us financially, perhaps with the agriculture sector, the tourism sector, and other areas of the economy?
In terms of the tourism sector, that program is ongoing. The loans are being distributed with the monies that we had from the CDB line of credit, with the interest rate being subsidized by government. That's very much in the process of loans having been approved and money being disbursed. In terms of the agriculture sector, that $8 million US from the World Bank, the first amount is being paid out, even as we speak, by the Social Investment Fund. They are the payors, so that it's not the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture agreed the recipients with the World Bank, and they are already being paid. The first set of payments should be completed just about around now, and then that's 1.5 or so million dollars. The balance of that's 1.5 US or Belize, Judith, I can't remember. But the balance of the 8 million, which is 8 million US, would then start to be paid out. Again, I don't think the payments will be complete before the elections come, but they would have started and will continue after the elections until the monies have been completely disbursed. And in terms of the IDB, we've gotten pretty much everything that we've asked for. The OFID people That's what continues to support us, to sustain us with the food assistance rollout. The 20 million was approved, but with them we have to find the monies, and that's part of the borrowing that we've done, the additional treasury notes that we've issued. We have to find the monies and then they reimburse us. But we are finding the monies and the reimbursement does take place. So again, they have come through. The only thing that's outstanding is that Kabay funding. And I did approach them fairly late because I wasn't aware that they were in position to help. I have no doubt, it's been like jumping through hoops. I speak to the president of the bank and he's fine, but then as you go down the food chain, there have been all sorts of requirements. I have no doubt, though, that it will come through, and that would then complete the circle. There would not have been any source of funding that I would have promised would take place that, in fact, would not have occurred. I did say that after this, remember that the World Bank, and that's how the unemployed will get on the BCAT program. The World Bank is also helping with that. So apart from that apart from the 8 million for agriculture, it's something like, is it 13 million for additional support, which will help to fund BCAT 2. I did say that the World Bank had agreed that there would be this $50 million loan approval done for a larger scale agricultural development program and and 50 million as well for social protection. Those will not be able to go to their board in time for before the general elections. But again, those are commitments that they've shown they will keep because they've delivered on every other commitment that they've made. So again, the incoming administration will have those two huge pools of loan funds on which to draw down for agriculture and for social protection.
Thank you, Sonny. We'll now move on to Ms. Renee Trujillo.
Conferences ago, I had asked you in terms of foreign investments, and you had mentioned to me that there was a committee looking at ways in how we can basically bring in new fresh money and new investments into the country. One of those examples you gave was the hemp industry. Like I mentioned, that was a few press conferences ago. Could you give us an update in terms of what ideas or initiatives that committee has come up with in terms of injecting new and fresh monies into the country?
Hemp licenses have been given, but there is a little bit of a problem, or perhaps a hell of a problem. The investors are finding that nobody in Belize will bank them. None of our commercial banks here will accept any account from any enterprise that has a license to do hemp and that is involved in the hemp industry. I have spoken to some of the banks myself because it is legal, and it is not only legal here, it is legal in the States, talking about hemp. I'm not talking about marijuana, where there's a difference between the federal approach in the US and the approach of individual states. The amount of THC content that we allow coincides with the US Farm Bill, whatever it is, with the US position. So what is to be classified as hemp in Belize by way of the law, by way of the SI, is also classified as hemp and not as marijuana in the US. So I really don't understand why there is this reluctance on the part of the financial institutions to bank these people. The only answer I was given is that the correspondent banks that are handling the accounts of the local banks have told our local banks, you are not to touch hemp. There's, in that context, nothing that we can do. No bank will run the risk of having its correspondent banking relationship cut off because it goes contrary to the dictates of what the correspondent banks are telling them. And so I just have to hope, for the sake of the industry and for the sake of Belize, that thing would have exploded in terms of economic activity and bringing in foreign exchange, the export of hemp. I have to hope that as the situation evolves, that the overseas banks will relent, will let up on this insistence that our local banks have nothing to do with hemp accounts. But that's the only hold-up. The people have their licenses, but nobody. You can't. You have to have a bank account to properly do business, as you know, and that really is the difficulty.
In terms of that, I know you said at this point there's nothing you can do, but has the government made any attempts or to speak or correspond to anybody in the U.S. in terms of this correspondent banking issue? Yeah, we seem to have some. No, I said I know you said that the government cannot do anything at this point, but were there any attempts in terms of trying to address the issue or overcome this obstacle in terms of the bank correspondence?
No, I look, there is no way we are going to be able to, in fact, leverage. We have no leverage. The institutions abroad to get them to change their policy. And I'm not even sure that the local banking institutions would want us to do that. People walk on, the financial institutions here walk on eggshells with respect to correspondent banking relationships. And basically they're saying to us, please leave well enough alone. Hopefully as time goes by, there would be a relenting on the part of the correspondent banks. But for now, we don't want to spook them. We don't want to give them the impression that we are pushing to do something that they have said we must not do. So I'm afraid, Renee, that in the circumstances we really are hog-tied, and while we certainly can continue to ask the local banks to every so often give a reminder to their correspondent banks that, well, but this thing is legal in the States. What is the problem? We really can't go beyond that.
Okay, my next question has to do with something you touched on earlier in terms of those in quarantine and those who are positive for COVID-19 and their voting rights. I have some people commenting that you are stripping them of their constitutional right to vote. So it's like you understand that there is this pandemic happening, and some people are basing their argument on their constitutional right to vote. Is it a final decision that these people will not be able to vote even by proxy or by some other form?
Well, certainly proxies are out. It's already a hugely complicated, nightmarish system to administer. The proxy system, which currently exists in terms of public officers, in terms of the security forces, and they're needing to vote by proxy. I don't see trying to in fact extend that to COVID positive people. How do you verify? How do you, that is completely out of the question. Now, I understand the argument about the constitutional rights, but remember, no constitutional right is absolute. You can't derogate from constitutional rights on an emergency basis. That is why, look, in the normal course, Belizeans have every right when they leave the country to come back in. But we're saying, no, you can't, except you comply with certain things or you go into quarantine. That is a derogation from what, in pure form, is their constitutional right. If you check the Constitution, it will tell you these are the rights, but they can all be derogated from, providing that you do so in a manner that's not disproportionate, and provided that you do so in, as it were, emergency situations, which is what this is. I regret, I say again, the fact that these people will not be able to vote. But if you stop to think about it for a moment, what would it do to others that are COVID-free, that want to vote, if they know that people who are in fact positive will also be allowed to vote? Even if you say, well, we're going to have a separate line, but we're going to have a separate polling station, that is going to be, already there are concerns about how much the presence of COVID-19 generally will depress voter turnout. If you let the public know that people who are COVID positive can come to vote, I think that's game over. So with, again, the greatest possible regret, I have to say that it's not going to happen. I do not see that COVID positive Belizeans will be allowed to vote. Don't see it.
Thank you, Renee. Renee, final one, Renee. We have to move on.
All right. Well, I'll take away the follow-up and I'll just go to my other question then, please. Prime Minister, the national security, we're coming under attack of sorts, if you want to look at it like that, where you have all arms of national security having infections of COVID-19. And then you also have the recent prison breakout where several prison officers were injured in the process. And then you had the shootout on Coastal Road where you had a BDF and a police shot as well. Could you give us your feedback and your comments on that situation involving national security?
What I want to do is to commend the national security personnel. I think all around they have done a phenomenal job. Dr. Manza made the point that there is some degree to which members of the security forces that have become infected and then in turn are seen as index cases may have been infected. I think he said as many as 80% are likely to have been infected, not in the course of discharging their duties, but in the course of going about their other business during their free time. But however it has happened, it serves to underline the monumental, the towering sacrifice that the members of the security forces are making to try to help to keep this country safe in the middle of the ravages of the pandemic. So I would start by absolutely saluting them. They are valuable in the same way that the medical professionals are. And this entire large grouping of what we call frontline personnel must absolutely be lauded, be praised to the skies. In terms of the fact that even in the middle of our other troubles, something like that prison break occurred. Well, most unfortunate. I'm not even going to point to the fact that the prison is privatized, and so it's not run by government. I think it's one of the perils of office. You're in government, anything happens, the government gets blamed. And that apart, even though the prison is privatized, when there is a break, and clearly you heard Commissioner Williams say that he's going to investigate thoroughly how this week happened, because it is my sense that it is his feeling that lots of portions of that narrative as to how the escape occurred don't quite add up. But again, in trying to recapture these prisoners, the fact that the security forces were shot at and 2 members were injured, shot at by one of the prisoners with this M4 carbine, which I understand to be a lethal weapon, also underscores how very much these people are being asked to do and are doing without any real complaining. When I hear some politicians talk about, the police and the GSU and the way they are treating citizens and all that sort of thing, nobody can doubt that there are excesses from time to time. But on the whole, every single Belizean should be proud in a general way of the security forces. Speaking for myself, I certainly am. I commend the Commissioner of Police and all members of the Belize Police Force. I commend the General of the BDF and all members of the BDF. And I am absolutely proud of the fact that, coming back again to the question of the prison break, while there was nothing they could do to prevent that since they were not in charge, the way they sprang into action, the success they've already had in terms of the numbers that have been recaptured, all these things convince me that I ought to repeat the position that every Belizean can, at this juncture, feel exceedingly good about our security forces and the fantastic job of work they're doing.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Aaron Humes, last one. Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Prime Minister. Good morning. Good afternoon now, because it's just about midday. Just 3 questions. I don't know if this has been covered previously, but if Director Bond is around, can she talk about the protocol for opening up the marine borders? So I guess the borders around the islands and so on, as opposed to the land. Are those still closed except for cargo and so on?
Land and sea borders remain closed. So there's really nothing to talk about. She told you there, when cruise tourism comes back, we will deal with that, and that is going to mean that then we're going to have to reopen certainly the maritime borders, the sea borders, but for now those remain closed.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. All right, then just 2 more things. One, in terms of relaxation, especially to allow for tourist visits, we see that in Europe, places like France, Great Britain, Spain, Italy are shutting down, and then the WHO has approved, for the most part, these decisions, given that they have said that lockdowns are not the only method of defense against COVID, but where it's needed, it is needed. So talk to us about our choice in approving these relaxations, considering the world situation.
Aaron, I don't see us resorting to any lockdowns between now and the date of the general elections. That is subject to change, but accepting that we have seen a significant increase in cases, still, Dr. Manza made the point, we're not yet at the stage where we're in danger of being completely overwhelmed in terms of hospital resources. You heard him say that there's this study that suggests we might be subject to a particularly virulent strain of COVID-19. No, as far as I am concerned, we must concede that there has been a degree to which we have been our own worst enemies. Both Judith and Karen and I think Dr. Manza addressed the fact that we need to ramp up the message. We need to preach the gospel with even more fervor, that people need to abide by the protocols that are in place. Remember, when you talk about a lockdown, all that can mean is that we're going to bring economic activity to a halt, because we already have in place the kinds of measures that you see people